Welcome to Story Planet, where every story is a journey. Find your coziest spot, let the world slow down, and step into a dream where childhood never fades. The soft hum of the evening breeze rustled the curtains in Violet's bedroom, carrying with it the scent of the garden outside. The world was quiet, save for the occasional creak of her rocking chair as she sat near the window, gazing out at the night. The stars twinkled above, casting a gentle silver glow over the room, and the moon hung low, watching over her as if it were an old friend. Violet was a woman of 78 years, though she carried her age with grace. There was something about her presence that felt warm and inviting, as though she were a book filled with stories waiting to be told. Her home, a quaint little cottage with ivy creeping along its stone walls, was nestled in a peaceful countryside, far from the rush of the world. She had lived here for many years, surrounded by the quiet comfort of solitude, her days spent tending to the garden, sipping tea by the fireplace, and reminiscing about the life she once knew. But tonight, her heart felt a little heavier. Memories of her youth danced through her mind, whispering to her in the hush of the evening. The village she grew up in had been a place of laughter, of mischief, of endless wonder. She had been a wild child once, climbing trees, running barefoot through the fields, laughing until her belly ached. Those were the days of scraped knees and whispered secrets, of sunlit afternoons spent chasing butterflies, and twilight hours filled with fireflies flickering in the dark. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, as if she could breathe in the scent of that long-lost past, the earthy aroma of damp soil after the rain, the sweetness of freshly baked bread from the village bakery, the faint trace of lavender from her grandmother's shawl. Time had taken those moments and tucked them away, like old photographs fading in an attic, but tonight they felt closer than ever. With a sigh, Violet made her way to bed, pulling the blankets over herself with slow, deliberate movements. The weight of the day settled over her, but there was something else too, a sense of longing, a quiet wish murmured to the night. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, and before she knew it, sleep took her gently by the hand. And then the dream began. The first thing she noticed was the warmth of the sun on her skin. It was a golden warmth, soft and comforting, like a familiar embrace. Then came the sound, the distant laughter of children, the chirping of birds high above, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Violet blinked, and suddenly, she was there. The village. Her village. It stood just as she remembered it, untouched by time, as though the years had never passed. The narrow cobbled streets were lined with small houses, their walls painted in warm, inviting hues. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted from the bakery at the corner, mixing with the sweet aroma of wildflowers that grew in patches along the paths. A fountain gurgled in the town square, its water clear and cool, reflecting the brilliant blue of the sky above. Violet looked down at herself, and a startled laugh escaped her lips. She was not the elderly woman who had gone to bed in a quiet cottage. She was a child again, barefoot, her legs tanned from the summer sun, her hands small and unlined. She touched her face, feeling the smoothness of youth, the boundless energy humming through her veins. Her heart pounded with excitement, disbelief, and a strange, undeniable sense of homecoming. Before she could make sense of it all, a familiar voice called out, "Violet, hurry up, slowpoke." She turned, and there they were, Tommy, the mischievous boy from next door, with his mop of unruly hair and a grin that always meant trouble. Beside him stood Eliza, her best friend, the one who had always dared her to climb higher, run faster, laugh louder. They looked just as they had all those years ago, young, wild, and full of mischief. Violet hesitated for only a moment before running toward them, her bare feet slapping against the cobbled street. The weight of the years had disappeared. There was only this moment, this impossible, wonderful moment. Tommy tossed her an apple, freshly plucked from the orchard. "Come on, we've got a plan." Eliza grinned, her green eyes twinkling. "The old mill, remember? Today's the day." Violet's heart leapt. The old mill, a place of whispered legends, of secrets, of endless possibilities. As a child, she had always been too afraid to explore it fully, but now, standing in the bright sunshine of her youth, fear was the last thing on her mind. She took a bite of the apple, its juice running down her chin, and laughed. "Let's go." And just like that, they were off, running through the village, past the bakery with its warm, buttery scent, past the market where vendors called out cheerful greetings. The world was alive, buzzing with energy, with the simple joys of childhood. As they neared the edge of the village, the old mill loomed ahead, its wooden frame weathered by time. It was half hidden by overgrown ivy, its tall, broken windows like watchful eyes. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and wildflowers, and for a moment Violet felt a flicker of hesitation. But then Eliza took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We can be scared later. Right now, we adventure." And with that, they stepped inside. Violet stirred in her sleep, a smile ghosting across her lips. The clock continued its steady rhythm. The wind whispered through the trees outside, and the stars blinked in silent approval. The dream was only just beginning. The morning sun bathed the village in a golden hue, illuminating the cobbled streets and casting soft shadows against the stone cottages. Violet stepped forward, the feeling of youth surging through her limbs, making her light on her feet. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the bakery, mingling with the earthy aroma of damp cobblestones. She turned her face to the sky, feeling the warm embrace of the sun, the sound of a bustling morning filling the air. Eliza pulled at her hand, eyes glinting with excitement. "Come on, let's go before old Mrs. Thornton catches us loitering in front of her garden again." Tommy was already ahead, weaving through the throng of villagers who were setting up their stalls in the marketplace. Baskets of ripe apples and pears were being placed with careful hands. Bundles of lavender and herbs hung from wooden racks, and the fishmonger's cart displayed glistening silver fish caught fresh from the river. The entire village hummed with the energy of the morning, and Violet felt her heart swell with the familiar rhythm of it all. But their destination was beyond the marketplace, past the old stone bridge that arched over the clear blue stream. They had plans, mischief in mind, and the whole day ahead to enact them. Eliza leaned close, whispering conspiratorially, "You know the Widow Martha's laundry line?" Violet bit her lip to keep from laughing. "The one with the oversized bloomers?" Tommy groaned, but couldn't hide his grin. "We're going to get in trouble. Again." "That's the fun of it," Eliza said, already veering off towards the widow's cottage, where long lines of freshly washed sheets and undergarments fluttered in the morning breeze. The three of them crouched low, sneaking around the fence that bordered the widow's garden. The air smelled of soap and lavender, and the sheets, a crisp white against the blue sky, billowed like sails on a ship. Violet caught Tommy's eye, then pointed at the largest pair of bloomers, pinned right in the middle. "If we tie those up on the weather vane on the bakery's roof, it'll be the talk of the village for days." Tommy hesitated only a moment before snatching them down. Eliza let out a delighted squeal as they ran, wind whipping past them as they made their escape. Behind them, a shrill voice rang out, "You rascals! Come back here this instant!" But they didn't stop. They ran past the tailor's shop, ducking into an alley, hearts pounding, laughter spilling from their lips. They didn't stop until they reached the bakery, breathless and giddy with triumph. "You two keep watch," Violet said, grabbing the bloomers and scrambling up the side of the bakery. The stones jutted out just enough to provide footholds, and with practiced ease, she climbed, reaching the weather vane at the top. She secured the bloomers tightly, watching them catch in the breeze like a victory flag. Below, Eliza and Tommy doubled over with laughter, pointing as villagers turned to look up, gasping and pointing at the spectacle. "Mission accomplished," Violet said, jumping down and dusting off her hands. "What's next?" Eliza's eyes gleamed. "The river." The three of them sprinted past the market square, dodging past carts and skipping over puddles left behind from the morning dew. The river was their sanctuary, the one place they could escape to when the weight of the world or the anger of Widow Martha threatened to catch up with them. They spent hours at the river. After their swim, they built small rafts out of twigs and sent them sailing downstream, pretending they were grand ships headed for the ends of the earth. They climbed the low branches of the willow tree that leaned over the water, daring each other to swing from the vines and leap into the depths below. They skipped stones across the water's surface, competing to see who could get the most skips. Each try met with cheers or groans of defeat. By midday, the sun hung high and hunger began to creep in. They made their way back to the village square, dripping wet and with their clothes stuck to their skin. The baker, shaking his head at their antics, handed them each a warm roll, stuffed with honey and butter. They sat in the shade of the fountain, biting into their treats as the villagers bustled around them, going about their daily lives. "I wish days like this never ended," Violet murmured, watching the clouds drift lazily above them. Eliza nodded, licking honey from her fingers. "We should make a pact," she said. "No matter what happens, we'll always find our way back here. Back to the village, back to the river." Tommy smirked. "Even when we're old and gray?" Violet grinned. "Especially then." They linked pinkies, sealing their vow with a laugh. Childhood stretched before them like an endless summer, and in that moment, they truly believed they had all the time in the world. Somewhere, far beyond the dream, Violet's older self stirred in her sleep, her lips curling into a soft smile. The dream was not just a memory. It was a gift, a return to the days of joy and boundless adventure. And she wasn't ready to wake up just yet. The morning air was crisp, with the scent of damp earth, the remnants of last night's rain still clinging to the cobblestone streets. Violet stretched her arms high above her head, feeling a boundless energy thrumming in her limbs. Today was not a day for ordinary games or simple mischief. It was a day for adventure. The plan had been whispered in hushed voices the evening before, under the great oak tree near the village square. The old mill stood at the very edge of their world, its shadow looming beyond the meadows and the wildflower fields. For years they had dared one another to go inside, but none had ever mustered the courage to step beyond its crooked wooden door. Today, that would change. Eliza and Tommy were already waiting when Violet arrived at their meeting place, a cluster of boulders that overlooked the grassy expanse leading to the mill. Tommy had a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, and Eliza held a candle stub and a handful of matches. They were prepared. "Do you think it's really haunted?" Eliza asked, her voice filled with an edge of both excitement and apprehension. Tommy scoffed, adjusting the rope. "Ghosts aren't real." Violet wasn't so sure. The mill had stood abandoned for as long as she could remember, its wooden beams warped with time, its towering frame groaning in the wind. Stories whispered among the villagers spoke of eerie lights flickering in its windows at night, of strange shadows moving behind the cracked glass. But she wasn't about to let fear stop her. "Only one way to find out," she said, grinning as she took the first step forward. They sprinted across the meadow, dodging clusters of tall grass and leaping over small streams. By the time they reached the old mill, their breath was heavy with anticipation. The massive wooden doors loomed before them, their surface splintered and worn, and with a firm push, Violet and Tommy forced one open, revealing the darkened interior. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of old wood and forgotten time filling their lungs. Shafts of sunlight streamed in through the cracked roof, illuminating floating specks of dust that twirled in the golden light. The great wooden gears of the mill stood frozen in time, their once mighty structure now brittle with neglect. Eliza clutched Violet's arm. "I don't like this." Violet squeezed her hand reassuringly before stepping deeper inside. "Come on, let's explore." The wooden planks creaked beneath their feet as they moved cautiously through the mill. Tommy ran his hands over the great gears, testing the wood for strength, while Eliza used the candle to peer into the darker corners. A rickety staircase wound its way to an upper level, its steps covered in a thick layer of dust. Violet gestured toward it. "Shall we?" Tommy grinned. "Race you to the top." The three of them scrambled up, their laughter echoing in the cavernous space. At the top, they found a small loft, its floor littered with old sacks of grain and rusted tools. But what caught Violet's attention was the small window that overlooked the entire village. The view was breathtaking. The river winding like a ribbon through the valley, the fields rolling into the distance, the rooftops of their village homes clustered together like a warm embrace. Eliza sighed, resting her chin on her knees. "I wish we could stay up here forever." Violet understood. Up here, the world felt limitless, the worries of the village far away. But adventure wasn't about standing still. It was about discovering what lay beyond. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters, sending a chill down their spines. Tommy frowned. "Did you hear that?" Violet froze, listening. A faint rustling noise echoed from below, followed by what sounded like a soft thud. The three exchanged wary glances. Eliza's voice trembled. What if someone's in here?" Tommy, ever the brave one, grabbed a rusted lantern from the floor. Only one way to find out. They tiptoed back down the stairs, their hearts hammering. As they reached the bottom, Violet spotted movement in the shadows near the old storage room. She sucked in a breath. "Who's there?" she called out. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows, two glowing eyes peered out at them. Eliza screamed, scrambling backward. Tommy lifted the lantern higher, his expression half brave, half terrified. A blur of fur darted out from the shadows, a fox, sleek and clever, its coat glistening in the dim light. It paused, staring at them with unblinking curiosity, before dashing through the open door and vanishing into the meadow beyond. Relief flooded Violet, followed quickly by laughter. "A ghost fox," she teased, nudging Eliza playfully. Eliza huffed, but a grin broke across her face. "You scared me half to death." Tommy shook his head, chuckling. "Come on, let's head back before someone realizes we're here." They took one last look around before stepping back into the sunshine. The mill, for all its mystery, no longer felt quite as menacing. Instead, it felt like a secret they had claimed for themselves, a piece of childhood adventure they would never forget. As they made their way home, Violet felt an ache in her chest. Not sadness, exactly, but the bittersweet pull of time. She knew, deep down, that these moments were fleeting, that one day they would all grow up and leave childish adventures behind. But today was not that day. She reached for Eliza's hand and squeezed it. "Same time tomorrow?" Eliza beamed. "Always." Tommy grinned, tossing his rope over his shoulder. Next time, we find a real ghost." They laughed, their voices carrying across the fields as the sun began its slow descent. Somewhere, in the quiet corners of her sleeping mind, the older Violet stirred, feeling the warmth of a memory long cherished. And as the dream continued, she knew one thing for certain. She was not ready to wake up just yet. The village square was alive with a vibrant energy, the air thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts, honeyed pastries, and freshly baked bread. Colorful banners and paper lanterns swayed gently in the warm evening breeze, casting a soft glow over the cobbled streets. The festival had arrived, and with it, a night of music, laughter, and carefree dancing beneath the stars. Violet stood at the edge of the square, her heart pounding with excitement. The entire village had gathered for the celebration, just as they had every summer when she was a child. She could see the familiar faces of neighbors and friends, each adorned in their best attire, their eyes shining with joy. The festival had always been her favorite time of year, a night when worries were left behind, and the world seemed to exist only for the pure delight of the present moment. "Come on, Slowpoke." Eliza grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the center of the square, where a wooden platform had been set up for dancing. Musicians stood nearby, their instruments gleaming in the lantern light. The lively sound of fiddles and tambourines filled the air, accompanied by the rhythmic tapping of drums. The melody was infectious, lifting spirits and setting feet into motion. Tommy appeared at their side, grinning mischievously. "Think you can keep up, Violet?" she laughed, swiping playfully at his arm. "I was born for this." The three of them linked hands, stepping onto the platform just as the music swelled. Around them, couples and friends twirled and clapped in time with the beat, their movements effortless, their faces alight with joy. The festival dance was something every child learned from the moment they could walk, a tradition passed down through generations. It was a dance of freedom, of uninhibited happiness, of losing oneself in the rhythm of the night. Violet spun and swayed, the world blurring around her in streaks of golden light. The laughter of children echoed through the air, blending with the melody in perfect harmony. The ground beneath her feet felt like nothing more than air, as if she were floating, weightless and untethered by time. The night stretched on, a tapestry of color and sound. Between dances, they wandered through the festival stalls, sampling sweet candies and fresh cider, watching the fire breathers and jugglers perform feats of magic. At one booth, an elderly woman sold delicate flower crowns woven from lavender and daisies. Eliza bought 3, placing one atop Violet's head with a satisfied smile. "There," she said. "Now you look like the queen of the festival." Violet beamed, adjusting the crown so that the petals brushed against her forehead. "Then I suppose I must act the part." She lifted her chin regally, taking exaggerated, graceful steps as she paraded through the square. Tommy and Eliza laughed, following her lead with equally ridiculous flourishes. The villagers, amused by their antics, clapped and cheered as if they truly were royalty passing through. As the evening deepened, the sky darkened into a velvety indigo, scattered with stars. The final dance of the night began, a slower, more wistful tune that carried a sense of nostalgia within its notes. Violet found herself stepping into the rhythm once more, her body moving instinctively to the music's gentle sway. She closed her eyes, letting herself be enveloped by the moment, by the warmth of the lantern light, the hum of familiar voices, the distant crackling of a bonfire. She felt a hand slip into hers. Startled, she opened her eyes to find Henry standing before her. His dark curls tousled, his gaze filled with something she couldn't quite name. He had been one of the quieter boys in the village, always watching from the edges, content to observe rather than participate. Yet here he was, standing before her, his hand in hers, his expression uncertain but hopeful. "May I have this dance?" he asked. Violet hesitated only for a moment before nodding. Yes. They moved together, their steps tentative at first, then surer, as the melody carried them forward. Henry's hand was warm in hers, his touch gentle but steady. They didn't speak, allowing the music to fill the space between them. Violet's heart fluttered, a sensation unfamiliar but thrilling. It was the kind of moment she had always imagined, the kind found in storybooks and whispered dreams. As the dance neared its end, Henry met her gaze and smiled. It was a smile that held no expectations, no promises, just the simple joy of the present. And that was enough. The final notes of the song faded into the night, leaving behind only the distant crackle of the bonfire and the murmurs of villagers bidding each other good night. Violet released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, stepping back as Henry did the same. "Thank you," he said softly. Violet nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." As the festival came to a close and the villagers began making their way home, Violet lingered for a moment longer, watching the lanterns flicker against the night sky. She felt a warmth settle deep within her, a contentment that wrapped around her like a well-loved blanket. She wasn't ready to wake up just yet. The golden hues of morning stretched lazily over the village, casting long beams of light through Violet's bedroom window. The warmth of the sun roused her gently, but instead of waking in her familiar home, she was still in the dream, still in the world of her childhood. And this morning, there was something different about the air. Something delicate yet charged, like the faintest whisper of a forgotten melody. She sat up, heart stirring with an unspoken anticipation. She could hear the distant chatter of villagers, the sound of carts rolling over the cobbled streets, and, above it all, the faint strumming of a lute coming from the village square. There was something about that music, something that sent a ripple through her heart. Eliza burst through the door moments later, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Violet, get up, we have to go." Violet stretched, a laugh escaping her lips. "What's the rush?" Eliza rolled her eyes dramatically. "The boys are setting up by the river today. They're going to be playing music, and—" She hesitated before adding, "Henry's going to be there." At the mention of his name, a different kind of warmth spread through Violet's chest, softer than the summer sun, but just as radiant. She had danced with Henry the night before, his quiet presence lingering in her mind even after the festival had ended. There was something about him, something gentle, something steady. But love, or even the whisper of it, had never been something she had known how to navigate. "You're blushing," Eliza teased, grabbing Violet's hand and tugging her out the door. Violet scoffed but didn't resist. Together, they ran through the village, past the bakery with its comforting aroma of warm bread, past the blacksmith's shop where sparks danced like fireflies in the morning light. The river wasn't far, but as they neared, Violet's steps faltered, her heart suddenly betraying her with nervous energy. Henry was there, just as Eliza had said, sitting on a fallen log, plucking gentle notes from the strings of his lute. He looked up as they approached, his eyes catching hers for the briefest of moments before he looked away, as if uncertain whether to hold her gaze. Tommy, never one to let an opportunity for mischief slip by, leaned in and whispered, "I think someone was waiting for you." Violet shot him a glare, but before she could reply, Henry set his lute aside and stood. "Violet," he greeted softly, nodding toward the water's edge. "Would you like to walk with me?" 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, but all she managed was a simple yes. The river stretched before them, shimmering in the morning sun. They walked in step, their silence comfortable, the world around them filled with the sounds of birds singing and the distant laughter of their friends. Violet kept her eyes on the rippling water, but she felt Henry watching her, his quiet presence grounding her in a way she didn't fully understand. "I saw you dancing last night," he said after a while. "You looked happy." She smiled, tilting her head toward him. "I was." He hesitated, his fingers grazing the petals of a wildflower growing near the path. "I wanted to ask you for a dance sooner," he admitted, "but I was afraid you'd say no." Violet's breath caught. She had spent so much of her childhood thinking of adventure, of mischief, of days spent laughing with Tommy and Eliza. Love had never been something she thought of as part of her story. But here was Henry, standing beside her, his voice filled with the quiet honesty of someone who had thought about this moment for far longer than she had. She reached down, plucking the wildflower he had just touched, twirling it between her fingers. "I wouldn't have said no." His expression softened, and for the first time she saw something unguarded in his eyes. Something real. The river's song carried on, unbroken by time, weaving between them a connection so fragile, yet so certain. It was a moment neither of them could name, yet neither of them wanted to break. From across the river, Tommy's voice shattered the delicate silence. "Are you two going to stand there staring at each other all day?" Violet groaned, turning on her heel. "Tommy, you are the worst." But Henry only laughed, a sound so warm and full that Violet found herself smiling despite her embarrassment. As they walked back toward their friends, she tucked the wildflower into the pocket of her dress, carrying with her the smallest, quietest hope that this was only the beginning. The rest of the day passed in a blur of laughter and golden sunlight. They swam in the river, skipping stones across its glassy surface. Henry played his lute again, filling the afternoon with melodies that spoke of stories untold. When the sun began to set, they lay in the grass, watching the sky turn from blue to gold to the deepest shades of indigo. Violet found herself beside Henry again, their arms barely brushing, but enough to make her heart skip a beat. She wanted to speak, to say something meaningful, but she didn't know what to say. Instead, she let the quiet remain, let it fill the space between them with something even words could not touch. As night fell, they made their way back to the village, the warmth of the day still lingering in their bones. Before parting ways, Henry hesitated, glancing down at her pocket. "You kept it," he noted, nodding toward the flower. Violet smiled, her fingers grazing the petals. "I did." He took a step back, hands in his pockets, before offering her one last smile. "Good night, Violet." "Good night, Henry." She watched him disappear into the evening shadows, her heart full of something unnamed, yet undeniable. Love had never been part of the plans she had made for her childhood. But perhaps, just perhaps, some things were meant to find you, even when you weren't looking. And as she drifted into sleep that night, still lost in the dream of yesterday, she wasn't ready to wake up just yet. The dawn was still breaking when Violet awoke, the sky painted in soft strokes of pink and lavender. The village remained quiet, wrapped in the hush of early morning. For a few moments, she lay still, listening to the distant rustling of leaves and the faint call of birds greeting the new day. But something within her stirred, an unshakable feeling that today was different, that something important lay ahead. A gentle knock sounded at her window. She turned to find Tommy grinning at her from outside, his hair ruffled from sleep and his eyes glinting with mischief. "Get dressed," he whispered, his breath clouding against the glass. "We're going on an adventure." Curiosity sparked inside her. "Where?" she asked, already sitting up. Tommy's grin widened. The road beyond the hills. We're finally going to see what's out there. Violet's heart thudded in her chest. The road beyond the hills. It was a place they had spoken of 100 times but never dared to go. It was where merchants came from distant lands, where travelers disappeared toward unknown destinations. It was a path that had always called to her, whispered of possibilities just beyond her reach. And yet, she had never taken that step. Until now. She dressed quickly, pulling on her sturdy shoes and grabbing a small cloth bag. When she slipped out the door, Tommy and Eliza were already waiting, their excitement palpable. Henry stood beside them, quiet but watching her with a look that made her chest tighten. He wasn't one for reckless adventures, yet here he was, ready to step beyond the familiar world they had always known. "Ready?" Eliza asked, bouncing on her heels. Violet nodded. "Let's go?" They moved quickly through the village, past the sleepy houses and the empty marketplace, toward the outskirts where the land stretched wide and open. The hills rose in the distance, bathed in the golden glow of the rising sun. The road beyond them shimmered in the morning light, winding into the unknown. Violet's breath caught as they reached the crest of the hill. From there they could see farther than ever before. Rolling meadows, thick forests, and a river that cut through the land like a silver thread. And beyond that, tiny specks that might have been towns, places she had only ever imagined. "This is it," Tommy whispered, "the world beyond our little village." For a long time, they just stood there, drinking in the sight of endless possibilities. Violet's heart pounded with longing, with the ache of knowing that this was the path she had always wondered about. And yet, she had never stepped forward. Henry's voice was soft when he spoke. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Violet turned to him, her chest tightening. "Sometimes." He nodded, as if he understood. "Me too." The weight of the moment settled over them. The road stretched ahead, beckoning, daring them to step forward. But something held them there, on the edge of everything, torn between what was safe and what was possible. Tommy broke the silence with a laugh. "Well, we made it. Guess that's enough adventure for today." Eliza rolled her eyes. "You mean you're scared?" "I mean I'm smart," Tommy countered, grinning. "And we'd probably get in trouble if we didn't come back." Violet let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They had made it this far, but they weren't quite ready to take that final step. Not yet. As they turned to walk back home, Violet glanced over her shoulder one last time, memorizing the way the road stretched endlessly before them. She knew that one day she would follow it. One day she would step beyond the hills and into the unknown. But today was not that day. Their journey back was quieter, contemplative. Each of them carried something unspoken, a lingering awareness that they had come closer than ever before to something profound. The village, once so small in their eyes, now felt different, as if it had shifted under the weight of their realization. It was home, but it was not the whole world. Eliza plucked a wildflower from the side of the road, twirling it between her fingers. "What do you think is really out there?" She mused aloud. Tommy shrugged, his voice unusually thoughtful. "Cities, kingdoms, maybe even ships that sail beyond the horizon. I bet there are people who don't even know our little village exists." Henry kicked at a small stone, sending it skittering down the path. "And yet, here we are, wondering if we belong anywhere else." Violet glanced at him, catching the slight furrow in his brow. "Do you think we're meant to leave?" she asked. Henry was quiet for a long moment before he replied, "I think some of us are." His words settled over them, heavy yet full of truth. Violet thought of the times she had stood at her bedroom window, staring at the hills, longing for something beyond the familiar. She thought of the stories travelers brought with them, of maps that stretched far beyond what she could comprehend. The village was safety. It was love. But it was also a small piece of something much larger. As they reached the village square, life had already begun to stir. The baker pulled fresh loaves from the oven, their golden crusts steaming in the cool morning air. A pair of old men sat outside the tailor's shop, engaged in their usual chess game. Mothers ushered their children toward the well, laughter and chattering filling the streets. Everything was as it had always been. Yet Violet felt something shift inside her. A quiet promise, a whisper of change, an understanding that she had seen beyond the hills, and now she could never unsee it. Eliza turned to her with a teasing grin. "So, what's the plan now? Run off and become an explorer?" Violet laughed, though the thought didn't seem quite as ridiculous as it once had. "Not today." Henry caught her gaze, a small knowing smile playing at his lips. "But someday?" She looked back at the hills, at the road that stretched into infinity. She didn't have an answer yet, but she knew she would one day. Violet slipped her hand into her pocket and felt the wild flower Eliza had given her, its petals soft against her fingers, a reminder of where she had been and of where she might someday go. But for now, she would stay in the village, in the dream of yesterday, for just a little while longer. She wasn't ready to wake up just yet. The morning sun peeked over the rooftops of the village, its golden rays streaming through the windows of Violet's childhood home. The warmth of the light kissed her face, and for a brief moment she remained still, absorbing the quiet comfort that surrounded her. The scent of freshly baked bread from the bakery drifted through the air, mingling with the familiar fragrance of lavender from the garden outside. The village was waking, and so was she. But today was different. She could feel it in her bones, a soft but certain pull in her heart. It was not an ordinary day. It was a day of remembering, a day of returning. Violet rose from her bed and dressed quickly, her hands moving on instinct, as if she had done this same routine 1,000 times before. When she stepped outside, the village square was already alive with the chatter of merchants setting up their stalls, the clatter of carts rolling over the cobblestone, and the occasional bursts of laughter from children running between the alleyways. The air felt lighter today, the colors of the world brighter, the sounds richer. Eliza and Tommy were waiting for her near the fountain, as if they knew she would come. They were both smiling, though there was something knowing in their eyes, something tender. "We're going to the orchard," Eliza said. "Everyone will be there." Violet tilted her head. "Everyone?" Tommy grinned. "You'll see." A gentle unease stirred inside her, but she didn't question it. Instead, she followed them through the winding streets of the village, past the familiar houses and the tiny shops that had once seemed so grand in her childhood eyes. The world felt untouched, unchanged, yet something deep inside her told her that this day would not be like any other. As they reached the orchard, Violet's steps slowed. Beneath the grand oak tree that had stood for generations, a gathering of familiar faces awaited her. But these were not just childhood friends. These were people she had not seen in years. People she had lost. Her heart clenched as she spotted them. Her parents, their eyes filled with warmth, their smiles exactly as she remembered. Her grandmother, sitting with a basket of apples in her lap, her laughter soft and knowing. Old neighbors, friends who had moved away, even the baker's kindly wife who had passed long ago. All were here, waiting as if they had never left. Violet's breath caught. She was dreaming. She knew that now. But that knowledge did not make this moment any less real, any less powerful. Her mother stepped forward, reaching out a hand. "You've grown so much," she whispered, her voice full of love. Tears burned at Violet's eyes as she took her mother's hand, feeling the warmth she had longed for all these years. "I've missed you," she said, her voice trembling. Her mother pulled her into an embrace, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Violet felt like a child again, safe, cherished, home. Around her, laughter and conversations carried through the orchard. People reminisced about old times, telling stories, sharing memories. The afternoon passed in a golden haze, filled with love and light. She sat under the oak tree, her fingers tracing the rough bark, remembering the times she had climbed it as a child, feeling invincible. Now it felt like a guardian, standing watch over this moment of reunion, as if time had never moved forward at all. The light filtered through its branches, dappling the ground with golden patches, and Violet felt something settle deep inside her, a peace she hadn't known she needed. At some point, Violet found herself sitting beside her grandmother, just as she had done so many times as a child. The old woman reached over, brushing a lock of hair from Violet's face. "Are you happy, my dear?" she asked gently. Violet swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I think I am." Her grandmother smiled knowingly. "That's all that matters." The smell of baked apples and cinnamon drifted from somewhere, and Violet's heart swelled with memories of her grandmother's kitchen, of afternoons spent rolling dough and licking sweet syrup from her fingers. She had spent so much of her life longing for this, to be here again, to be small again, to be loved without question. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the orchard. A peaceful stillness settled over the gathering, a sense of completeness that Violet had never quite felt before. She looked around at the faces she loved, at the village she had cherished, and something inside her whispered that this was a farewell. She wasn't sad, not really, because for the first time, she understood. These memories, these people, this village, they would always be with her. They were woven into the very fabric of who she was. And though she would wake from this dream, she would never truly leave it behind. As the evening deepened, the sky turning a deep indigo, the villagers began lighting lanterns, placing them in the river that ran alongside the orchard. The warm glow of flickering lights drifted along the water's surface, carrying whispered wishes and quiet farewells. Violet knelt beside the riverbank, holding a lantern in her hands. She closed her eyes and whispered a wish, though she did not need to say it aloud to know what it was. She released the lantern, watching it float away with the others, joining the lights of those who had come before. The gentle current carried them toward the horizon, fading into the distance, glowing like stars fallen from the heavens. The moment felt eternal, as though she existed in a place where time had no meaning, where love and memory were the only truths that mattered. She felt a presence beside her and turned to find Henry standing there, his hands tucked in his pockets, watching the lanterns with the same quiet reverence. He looked at her then, his gaze soft, filled with understanding. "You don't have to let go," he said quietly. "Not really." Violet nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I know." And she did. She knew now that letting go didn't mean forgetting. That love, once given, never truly faded. That this village, these people, this dream, they would always be within her, waiting for her, in the quiet corners of her heart. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, Violet closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the moment settle deep in her soul. She wasn't afraid to wake up anymore. The night was still, the air thick with the gentle hum of crickets and the occasional whisper of the wind as it moved through the trees. Violet stood by the river's edge, watching the last of the lanterns drift beyond the horizon. their golden glow flickering like stars upon the water's surface. The dream had stretched longer than she had ever expected, wrapping her in a world so warm and real that she had almost forgotten it wasn't the present. She was not afraid to wake up anymore, but the thought of leaving this behind still weighed heavy on her heart. Soft footsteps approached, and she turned to find Henry standing beside her once more. His presence had been constant in these last few nights of dreaming, steady and grounding, like an anchor tethering her to this place. He did not speak right away, simply watching the water as she did, as if he too understood that they were running out of time. "You look like you're thinking about something," he finally said. Violet exhaled a quiet laugh, crossing her arms over her chest. "I think I'm trying to say goodbye." Henry nodded, thoughtful. "Do you have to?" She looked up at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "This place, these people, your memories, they live in you, Violet. Just because you wake up doesn't mean you have to let go." His words settled over her like a soft breeze, and she realized that she had spent so long believing that waking would mean losing all of this. That when her eyes opened to the world beyond her dreams, the warmth of her childhood, the people she had loved, the moments she had relived, would all fade like morning mist. But Henry was right. This dream, this village, would never truly leave her. As long as she carried it in her heart, it would always be there. The sky above shifted, the deep indigo of night beginning to blur into the earliest hints of dawn. The dream was ending. She could feel it now, the way the air shimmered around her, the way the edges of everything felt softer, less tangible. It was time. Eliza and Tommy appeared from the path leading back into the village, their faces glowing in the lantern light. They smiled at her, but there was an understanding in their eyes, a quiet farewell in the way they looked at her, as if they already knew what was happening. "Leaving already?" Tommy teased, though his voice was gentler than usual. Violet managed a small smile. "It looks like it." Eliza stepped forward and pulled her into a tight hug, her embrace warm and familiar. "You'll come back, won't you?" Violet hesitated before nodding. "I think I always will." Tommy ruffled her hair playfully, as he had done when they were children. "Good, because we'd miss you too much otherwise." A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She turned back to Henry, meeting his steady gaze. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'll see you again," he murmured. And somehow, she knew he was right. The world around her began to shift, the colors bleeding into one another, the edges of the dream softening into something ethereal. The warmth of the lanterns, the whispers of the trees, the laughter of her friends. Everything began to dissolve, not in loss, but in a quiet, peaceful farewell. Violet closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she was home. She lay in her bed, sunlight streaming through the curtains, the familiar hum of the world waking around her. The scent of fresh morning air filled the room, and as she sat up, she felt something in her hand. Her fingers curled around a small, delicate wildflower, its petals slightly crushed but still vivid with color. A smile spread across her lips, and in that moment she knew. The dream had never really ended. It never would. Thank you for visiting Story Planet. If the Priceless Dream made you smile, brought back a memory, or simply wrapped you in warmth, consider giving it a thumbs up. And if it feels worthy, share it with someone you love. Stories are meant to be felt, remembered, and passed on. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Story Planet for more cozy escapes, gentle journeys, and peaceful nights. Until next time, may your dreams be priceless.